John here with Ripewave Audio, back for the final part and conclusion of our 4-model super comparison of Denon and Marantz AV receivers that all support a 7.4.4 speaker configuration, that all support Dolby Atmos, DTS:X, and Aural 3D, which all come standard with Audyssey room calibration, but are upgradable for a price to Dirac Live, and all have 9 channels of amplification. Now, these 4 models sell at different prices. And why is there such a variation in these cost points of each of these models? Is it something that comes across as features or as sound quality? And this is what we've delved into in this multi-part series, which started with a live unboxing, and then we had part 1 and part 2. And part 1 we handled the setup and went over some of the room calibration, and in part 2 we began our listening test, but all with external amplification with each of these models, just to normalize everything down so that we didn't have any of the influences of the internal amplifiers, and we could hear these things for what they're really processing. Now, in part 3, we will get into the internal amplifiers and how they compare, and they do have different ratings, and this is what is ultimately most evident when you first look at these models. Now, let's talk about what we have here. We have the entry-level model here, which is the Denon AVR X3800H, which sells for $1,700. We have the Marantz Cinema 50, which comes in at $2,500. We also have at $2,500 the Denon AVR X4800H, and finally the top of the line model here as far as price is the Marantz Cinema 40, which comes out at $3,500. Now, these were all introduced in the recent months at the end of 2022 and into early 2023, and these are now available for sale from your Denon and Marantz retailers. Now, one of the things that shows most prevalent in these specifications beyond the price is the power ratings. The 3800 is rated at 9 channels of amplification, 105 watts per channel, but that's 2 channels driven. And this is how they specify them across the board here. And so the 3800 being 105 watts per channel, the Marantz Cinema 50 a little bit more at 110, and the 4800 comes in at 125 watts per channel, as well as the Cinema 40 also at 125 watts per channel. Now, there's another model not shown here, which is the Denon AVR A1H, and this one is a beast. It even has more channels of amplification at 150 watts per channel, and that one, of course, is more money. That one, it really just tops off the whole line at $6,500 for the most expensive AV receiver from either Denon or Marantz. Now, Marantz has their AV10 processor at $7,000, but doesn't have any amplification built into it. And by the way, that Denon A1H gives you 15 channels of amplification. So I don't think there's anything out there in the world that gives you that much power for that many channels all in one unit. But today we're not looking at those models. We're looking at all the ones that support a 7.4.4 configuration with 9 channels of amplification. Now, as we said before, there's really 2 tiers of products here. This 3800H and the Cinema 50 are the first class, and the second class is the X4800 and the Cinema 40. And we've noticed this so far in our comparisons. As you move up between those 2 tiers, this is where you start to see some differences beyond the cost that are most noticeable. Now, obviously, between Marantz and Denon, you have a different look and feel, and we've covered all this, everything down to the porthole design of Marantz, to the more traditional look of Denon here. Some models have doors that open up where you can get to additional features. The one model that doesn't have that is the 3800H. The Marantz Cinema 50, from an ergonomics point of view, you just have this porthole display. Everything else has our traditional dot matrix two-line display, including the Cinema 40. But the Cinema 50, you don't have that capability on this. So for those who do not like the porthole, the Cinema 50 I wouldn't recommend for that reason there. But beyond the cosmetic parts here, and of course the Cinema 40 has the little side lights that are on there that gives that little extra sparkle, but they're not that bright. Even if I turn all the lights off in the room, in fact, it even dims down even further, so they're really not trying to make this have a lot of illumination on those side lightings. But what I want to talk about today is the internal amplifiers. And we showed you this picture before of the internals of this. And we talk about going up the different classes. So the Marantz Cinema 50 and the Denon X3800 share a lot of the same internals. In fact, I can't really see a difference other than the way the power supply is labeled internally, whether it's Denon or Marantz for that E-core transformer. The power supply and the heat sinks and the boards all seem to match on these entry-level tier models, just regardless of the brand and regardless of the difference of price, which is $800 between the 3800, which is $1,700, and the Cinema 50, which is $2,500. So you're paying a lot more for the Marantz brand and these additional cosmetics that it has. And we also do in our videos earlier talk about the differences in remotes, and the Marantz remote has backlight versus the Denon does not. Now, when you move up to the next tier of product, which is the X4800 from Denon and the Cinema 40 from Marantz, you can see that the power supply has a little bit different, upgraded power supply, but the heat sinks are even more obvious. The dissipating the heat. The ratings, of course, are a little higher on the power output for the 9 channels of amplification. So naturally, they want to have an improved heat sink to dissipate all that heat. And I don't notice any fans in these units. This is one of the first units in recent history that we brought in that doesn't have a fan. The Onkyo TX-RZ50 had a fan, although I could barely hear it. The Anthem AVM70 definitely had a fan. It didn't have any internal amplifications, and you could hear the fan, which is a deal breaker for somebody like myself, and I think a lot of you as well, is being able to hear a fan that comes on. I'm not as concerned about the fans themselves. So we went through all of this comparison, and you can go back to the other parts of the video, but the Denons do have these extra sound modes that are in them, the rock, the jazz club, the video game modes, and the matrix modes, which you don't get in the Marantz models. For whatever reason, they're giving this little extra feature in Denon. So you could go back to our other part 2 that explains that more. The upper tier also gives you the Zone 3 output, which you don't get on the others, as well as it has an additional HDMI input. So I just wanted to cover those in case you hadn't seen the other videos and didn't want to sit through another hour at this time. This video is going to be a lot quicker than the previous ones, is at least what I'm intending here. But otherwise, the software feature sets are all quite the same between these models, and there's some subtle differences on the back with the type of connectors it uses and all that. I will also mention that the upper tier does support a composite and component inputs, though somebody did write in that said they're useless from his perspective because they don't support the better frame rates, interlace versus progressive scanning and all that. So something to consider that even though it has composite and component inputs, it may not support all your devices. And then finally, the other subtle differences on the back is the upper tier is going to give you 2 more trigger outputs for a total of 3 on those products. Now, when we did our listening test in the prior videos, we did determine that when you did pay more, you got a little bit more from Denon and Marantz. And when you applied Dirac Live, that sound quality was improved. So it was a little more spacious, a little more rich in our 2-dimensional matrix of articulating what we're hearing here. Now, we didn't think that any of these models were quite as good as our RMC1 Emotiva or our Anthem AVM70, which are processor separates. And I know a lot of you are saying that's not a fair comparison, but it's in here to really show that if you move from a receiver class product to a processor, you can get a better sonic experience. But we're not going to take that for granted for every review. I bet there are some processors out there that, for example, don't sound as good as the Marantz Cinema 40. And as we go along, we're hoping to uncover any models that might be the case. The Onkyo TX-RZ50 we did determine was really the real bargain here, because you can spend a lot less money for an Onkyo TX-RZ50 and be able to hold its own against the upper tier with Denon Marantz for the speaker layouts we're talking about, albeit it only has a single subwoofer output. But ultimately, it sounded good, and I wasn't quite missing the independent controls in the subwoofer for the Onkyo. But it's nice to know that you're getting the independent control. And I do believe where we get better about room calibration, having those independent controls will make a difference. But as far as running Dirac out of the box or other calibration techniques, I didn't really appreciate the independent subwoofer outputs as much as I thought I would. So let's talk about why we came here for this video. The internal amplifiers, all 9 channels of amplification. And one thing I do want to point out is the difference in reported outputs. We're going from the 3800, which is 105 watts per channel, 2 channels driven into 8 ohms, to the Cinema 40, which is 125 watts, the same characteristics. In fact, you could even look at the Denon AVR A1H, which is 150 watts per channel. And the difference of going from around 100 watts to 150 watts doesn't really equate to that much of a SPL level change. In fact, we ran a calculator on this. So if you look at, let's say, the 3800 and say, okay, I want to move up to the 4800, and I know I'm going to go from 105 watts reported to 125. Oh, that sounds like a lot. But when you put it in terms of decibels, in which you can actually hear, that's 0.8 decibel if you run it through a calculator, a change in there. The Cinema 50, moving from the Cinema 50 to the Cinema 40 is a little less at 0.6 because you're going from 110 to 125. But if you also think about if I was going to go from the lowest cost model here, which is 105 watts per channel, to the full-blown Denon flagship, $6,500. I say, great, I'm going to get 150 watts per channel. That's only going to give you 1.5 decibels more of appreciable output. So what is really the value here? The value here of going up to a higher wattage, I believe, is that sustained, when I'm running all my speakers, do I have some headroom here? So that can help. But again, if you're looking at it at the Denon Marantz 70% rule, which is for an all channels driven rating, which they don't come out and publish, and I put the numbers in here. So if you do at the 70% rule, that 3800 is 74 watts per channel, all channels driven. The Cinema 50 is 77 watts per channel. The Cinema 40 and the 4800 is 88 watts per channel, and the A1H is 105 watts per channel. It's not a lot difference in the grand scheme of things. I think it's a bit of a marketing tool to show you're getting a little bit more wattage output with each model. Now, when I'm running this with external amplifiers, particularly up front where I have my Emotiva XPA 1 Gen 2s, they are rated at 600 watts into 8 ohms and 1,000 watts into 4 ohms. I've got 4 ohm speakers here. Now, here's where it gets interesting. I did A/B tests. So I have my Duke Audio switcher for speaker outputs. So I can run preamp out from these to the Emotiva amplifiers. And I can run the internal amplifiers and then take the outputs from the amplifiers, the internal ones and the external ones, put them in the A/B switch, and use a little remote here and hit the A/Bs. Now, it's not a blind test, although I cannot see the light up in the front of the room, so sometimes I lose track of which is A and which is B. But it doesn't matter because I really can't hear much of a difference. Even when comparing the internal amplifiers. Now, this is two-channel mode at low listening levels between, or reasonable listening, between the internal amps and using external amps. And so, well, why then I would ever use external amps other than filling those extra 2 channels I need to put in, because there are, this is a 11.4 processor, a receiver, and there's only 9 channels of amplification. So how do I get the extra 2? You definitely need 2 channels, and usually would put that on your front. I would say the reason is to reduce the load. These things can get hot. The more amplifiers you run in one box, the hotter it gets. The other thing is when you're listening to very dynamic content with a lot of energy going across all your speakers, your 7 ear level speakers, your 4 in the ceiling, and your subwoofers. Well, the subwoofers are self-powered anyways, but at least those 11 channels, that uses a lot of energy, and you have the dynamics. And the more you can offload off of a single chassis, the more you're going to be ready for these dynamic passages. But if just listening 2-channel mode, there isn't a lot of justification for me to say, don't use what's in these units and use something like my Emotiva external. I can hear a little bit of a difference, but it's not a lot. And you spend a lot of money for the caliber amplifier that I have. And you can spend a lot more and get an even higher caliber amplifier. Even when comparing with the 3800 or even the Cinema 50, the differences are subtle. So, and I couldn't hear, I even did a comparison between the 3800 and the Cinema 40. Now, when I'm using that, I really can't isolate out the internal processing and how they're calibrated. So, as a result, it's hard for me to tell how much of what I'm hearing is the result of better processing and better room calibration than in the amplifiers themselves. And this is why the comparison against external amplifiers gives me a more light comparison. Because when I'm doing the external amplifiers, I'm doing it going through the same circuitry. So I'll run it through for the Cinema 40, and I'll run it through the 3800 and the 4800 and the Cinema 50. And those are going to be my A/B between internal to external. But if I go internal 4800 to internal 3800, you just don't know what's really influencing that output. But based off of my internal versus external, there's not much of a difference there anyways. Do yourself a favor. You can save money on a lot of external amplifiers as long as you don't think you need those for the dynamics, for cutting down on the amount of heat that's generated in these units. And when you use these units, you can go and change your pre-out mode on your speaker configuration to be pre-out only and not pre-out plus amp. And that will shut down your amp and shut down that extra, and you get a little extra boost from that, but not much. That's audible. These things can be measurable, but not audible. Now, where I think measurements are good, you really get a clear indication of what's good, better, and best. Now, who is really the winner? So you do get a little bit from each of these circuitry improvements. So what does it come down to? What is my ultimate conclusion here? You all know that I own the Cinema 50. Now, would I have made that same choice today, now having brought all 4 of these in? Now, 3 of these are going back. All of them are going to go back except for the Cinema 50, which I own. And the other ones, they're going back to Amazon. I'm going to get reimbursed for my $7,000 plus that I shelled out to do this video. But I'll get that back. The other ones have to go back. But if I really could keep one, which one would I keep? Well, if it was purely a budget decision, I don't think I'd have any problem keeping the 3800 if I really was just on a budget. Now, there's some things as you move up that it's hard to give up on once you've seen it. The way the knobs feel on the 4800 versus the 3800, the Japan-made one versus Vietnam. You miss that, having seen both of them. So, is it worth $800 more? No, it's not worth it from a pure dollar. Having seen the extra line displays, I'd rather spend my own, if it's not a budget decision, I'd want the display. I'd pay $1,000 more to have that because every time I look at this, I can't see the porthole. Now, 4800 versus 40, it's a little hard decision, but I personally like this look better. This, to me, looks better. This is just so classic that it really isn't a design that has changed much over the decades. This looks new to me. This looks more modern, especially if it's in a visible spot. This Cinema 40, to me, I see what Marantz and Denon are doing with their pricing. They're giving you hard decisions because it's really not going to be the sound quality that's going to force you to go to the next model. It's all these little things that start to add up. My problem is I don't think it's worth the amount of money difference between the 3800, which is a $1,700 unit, the nearly double Marantz 40, which comes in at $3,500. It's a little hard to justify. But if you're an enthusiast and you've been saving your money for this, sometimes you just pay a little bit more to get the exact experience that you want. So if I was to be my choice, I'd probably put up the money to get the Cinema 40. But I know that it's not buying me that much more. I think it's a lot easier to justify the 4800, which comes at $2,500, paying that extra $800 from a monetary point of view. I think I would recommend it more to more of you that can go up from a $1,700 unit to a $2,500, maybe saving for another 6 to 12 months. and getting it, because I think the jump between the tiers is worth it. I do hear sonically a difference between going from first tier to second tier. What are your thoughts? That feedback would be really useful to this community. Do you think my conclusions are on track? If you differ from me, that's okay. I want to hear about that. I can learn from you as well. And if you enjoyed this video and this series, please like and subscribe. If you missed the other videos, go back and look at them. We invite you to do that. If you want to take your involvement to the next level, consider going to our Patreon channel at www.patreon.com/Ripewave. You can always give us a one-time donation. That really helps us, and I've noticed that some of you have been doing that lately. Thank you very much. That's going to help us bring in the next series for next month's videos. Try to guess at what products we're going to be bringing in next. And you can always hit that bell notification so you're informed when the next video is posted. Until then, keep evolving your audio experience.